For those who don't know, there's actually a quite substantial risk that Scotland could leave the UK. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't care about this too much, because I would like to think that borders are becoming increasingly irrelevant in our modern globalized society, and therefore it really doesn't matter how many arbitrary lines get drawn at whatever point anywhere on the British Isles. Unfortunately, one reason why Scotland is much more likely to leave the UK nowadays is precisely because of Brexit, which the vast majority of people in Scotland appear not to support. And indeed, Brexit would make any new borders within Europe of substantially greater interest to the UK and British citizens like myself. Basically, it's this massive step in the wrong direction in terms of defeating nationalism that has itself justified my own nationalistic desire to keep Scotland within the UK. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more important national borders are in the general international order, the more important they will be to me as an individual within any given nation. To add irony on top of ironies, it is, in a roundabout sense, precisely because Scotland overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU, that I would want them to remain in the UK. The fact that they are generally moving in more of a lefty, progressive, cosmopolitan direction on most issues means that if they were to leave the UK, the Overton window in this country would shift even further to the right, which is unpalatable to me in our 10th year of Conservative rule. Basically, I want to hold Scotland hostage for the sake of the effect they have on our elections, which is to say, about 50 reliably left-of-centre seats in Parliament. On the surface, the purpose of this video is therefore to present a means by which Scotland could be quite comfortably kept within the United Kingdom without actually having to change anything dramatic in this country. Perhaps on a more deep level, it's just me wanting to show off my fantastic ability to solve existential threats to the UK in my spare time. But I also think that this is an interesting example of how you can manipulate identities in order to get what you want in politics, which I think has a huge amount of potential implications, so I'll probably discuss that at the end of this video. So, just again, to set the scene, Scotland wants to leave the UK because they're a proportionally quite small country that has a very distinct national identity to the rest of the UK, and also they feel that the British government is doing a lot of stuff that they can't really get behind. Significantly, the solution I'm going to propose involves doing absolutely nothing to change that third point. It would be very easy to keep Scotland in the Union by simply systematically redressing every grievance of the average Scottish person. However, under the solution I'm proposing, the British government can continue doing whatever they want to do while not risking Scottish independence. And it all starts with what's called the West Lothian question. This relates to the fact that Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland all have their own parliaments that can vote on specific issues to those three countries. However, there is no English Parliament that can vote on issues that only concern England. As such, the national politics of England are voted on by representatives from other countries. Now, this is often presented as being an example of how actually the English are hard done by, and that the other countries should really cut us English some slack. For example, CGP Grey in his YouTube video on the UK said this:
The Northern Irish, Scottish and Welsh regard the English as slave-driving colonial masters, no matter that all three have their own devolved parliaments and are allowed to vote on English laws, despite the reverse not being true.
Now, as is pretty much always the case with CGP Grey when he's doing anything more sophisticated than summarising a Wikipedia article, this is wrong. I mean, it's not the most wrong CGP Grey has ever been. This isn't the video where he argues the monarchy actually makes the UK money, or insists that caffeine is a totally unproblematised drug, or he just straight up rips off Jared Diamond's book, even though Jared Diamond's work is considered to be incredibly reductionist and misleading by most serious historians. However, when you think about it for a second, you realise something. Who votes on English laws? The British Parliament. Now, it doesn't really make sense that this would make English people angry. After all, the British Parliament is made up overwhelmingly of English representatives. However, there's a very obvious reason why this might make Scottish people angry. Because think about it. If the British Parliament has both the job of voting on laws affecting Britain and laws affecting England, then that gives Parliament a dual function. It's both the English Parliament and the British Parliament. What does that imply about the British government? What does that imply about Britain as a concept? Pretty obviously it suggests that just as the British Parliament is basically the English Parliament, so too would it follow that Britain is basically England. This is a fundamental problem with Britain. Too often on the international stage, Britain is conflated with England, and this is understandably going to make people who are not English feel that they are also not British. The fact that the British Parliament is also functionally the English Parliament is just another reification of that reality. It's a bit tautological. For a Scottish person, they're going to have their local parliament, which represents them, and then they're going to have the British Parliament, which, in their view, represents England. And it's pretty hard to argue against that when the British Parliament literally has a secondary purpose, serving as the English Parliament. So what's the solution? Well, quite obviously it would be to solve the West Lothian question by establishing an English Parliament. Not because English people are underrepresented or something, that would be stupid to suggest. Rather, simply because of the optics for Westminster. Suddenly the British Parliament is not an English Parliament with extended influence, but simply exactly what it says on the tin, a Parliament that establishes laws for Britain, and presides over the 4 English, Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish parliaments. However, really this problem is just part of a wider issue, which is that the UK has a quasi-federal system. This basically means a system that is sort of federated, but in a wildly inconsistent way. As already established, for example, England isn't a federal subdivision of the UK at all. On top of that, even the 3 other countries within the UK aren't equally federated. Wales generally has the least autonomy from Westminster, Northern Ireland is in the middle, and Scotland has the most. So if you take a federal government like the United States, the quasi-federal British equivalent to that would be if one gigantic coast-to-coast patch of land covering the vast majority of the American population was essentially unitary, while a vast, sparse area of land in the north was very independent, Hawaii and Alaska were somewhat independent, and the Pacific Northwest was minimally independent. Imagine that, and the resentment that might fuel against the gigantic and overly populous coast-to-coast country, and you can basically understand why Britain, being quasi-federal, is a huge source of discontent. In Scotland's view, they're already unique in having one foot out the door. The key word there, I would submit, is unique. And this is my big solution. Federate the United Kingdom properly and officially. In other words, make it so that all the subdivisions of the UK are equally autonomous in relation to one centralised government. Essentially the same way that countries like America and Germany operate currently. Britain would become one federal kingdom comprised of 4 states. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't have it be a federal kingdom because I don't think you need me to tell you that I'm not a supporter of the monarchy. This change would be almost cosmetic. It isn't some groundbreaking seismic shift. Indeed, for Scotland, nothing would change at all. They wouldn't be given any greater autonomy than they currently have. Heck, they could possibly even have some autonomy stripped away from them without too much discontent. The point is that Scotland would no longer have cause to consider themselves that one uniquely independent part of the UK that could just go off and do their own thing. Instead, Scotland would, with one modest constitutional tweak, become one federal state among several. But still, we're not quite there. We've given England its own parliament, so Scotland can't feel that the British Parliament is just the English Parliament, and we've made all the states equally federal, so Scotland can't feel that they're this unique lone wolf. But there's a pretty obvious reason why Scotland might still feel a little bit under the thumb of England. England has a population that basically dwarfs Scotland, and despite changing the roles of the Parliament, England still contains Britain's capital city. So how can we fix this? Mass migration of people moving Westminster? The best solution is again far more simple, and again wouldn't require any fundamental changes to the government's relationship with Scotland. In fact, it again wouldn't actually affect Scotland at all. Split up England. Don't have England be this one massive state that makes up 84% of Britain's population. And there would be nothing dishonest about this change, nothing dishonest about splitting England in twain, because guess what? The north and the south of England don't really get along. Indeed, for most people who actually live in England, England already is split in between the north and the south. The issue is that right now Scotland sees itself as one country out of 4, but with one of those countries being much more powerful than the rest. However, what if Scotland instead saw itself as one state out of 5? Suddenly, Scotland wouldn't really be able to ground their historic rivalry with England in terms of their political distance from Westminster, because now, the north of England, which is just as hostile to Westminster and feels just as underrepresented by the southeast, would also be in the exact same boat. In Scotland's dislike of Westminster, and their feelings of being under the thumb of London, and even in their small population relative to their land area, they would have an ally, Northern England. The point being, it's pretty hard to express your political discontent in a desire for independence from England when almost every single factor that inclines you towards independence is shared by one half of England. This, at its core, is the essence of this as a solution. The majority of people in the UK, I would guess, feel unrepresented by Westminster. Even lots of people who voted for the winning party would probably say that they don't really feel like the MPs in London can truly understand and thus represent them. The issue is that it's only really Scotland who has tied their sense of being unrepresented by Westminster to their sense of national identity. However, what if Scotland was placed on the same level as the various regions of England? Suddenly the idea of them leaving the UK because they're one of the many states that feels unrepresented by Westminster would feel kind of silly. The point is that Scotland's separatism is based on a dualistic understanding of Great Britain, where there is England and Wales on one side and Scotland on the other. It's very easy for Scottish people to have this understanding when the current structure of the British government automatically casts Scotland off as its own little quasi-sovereign nation-state. But if the UK was federalised, suddenly Scotland is no longer cast out as its own peculiarity, but rather brought into the fold as one state among many. Now, I think the most obvious response to all of this would be, alright, but surely for this to work, the people of Scotland would need to buy that these divisions in England are authentic. You couldn't just split up a country and then claim that all these different regions have an identity as firmly established as Scotland's. This is true, but it's important to bear in mind that for many people in England, these identities are incredibly robust and real. The obvious example would be the divide in England between the North and the South. If you know anything about England, you'll know that this division is real. And with this small division, suddenly Scotland being like, well, we can't be part of the UK because we're not really part of the whole Westminster London scene, becomes far less credible when now 4 out of 5 states in the UK could make that same claim. And again, this isn't just the north of England playing it up for the sake of solidarity. People in northern England genuinely do feel every bit as distinct from the south of England as anybody from the other countries would. But still, there are 2 issues. The first is that by calling these states Northern and Southern England, you're still putting a big reminder that there does exist this concept of England that Scotland can be defined in opposition to. However, the second issue is that these 2 halves of England are still incredibly big. So maybe we should have a quick think about different divisions in England that would be based on people's real sense of identity, but also create some evenly sized states. So let's do that. If we start with the north for a second, as somebody who has family in Leicestershire, I happen to know that Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire are all pretty tight with each other. Throw Lincolnshire in and that's a state. And this actually roughly forms what's considered to be the East Midlands. The West Midlands, on the other hand, are centred around Birmingham, so it makes sense to throw together Birmingham, Warwickshire, Staffordshire, Shropshire and Worcestershire. If you look up to the north, then immediately these 4 counties, which are collectively known as Yorkshire, should jump out at you, and this leaves the extreme north of England to come together as one state from coast to coast. And now you, through the process of elimination, defined our final state of Lancashire, Merseyside, Manchester and Cheshire. I maintain that every single one of these states could claim with complete legitimacy that, yeah, sure, Scotland is bothered that they're not represented by London, but join the club. And suddenly, where Scotland was previously just conceptualising their hostility towards Westminster as hostility to England, now it's a sense of solidarity with several states that Scotland is constitutionally on the same level as, which are within England. However, this wouldn't quite solve the naming issue. If these states have real identities, they should have real names that define them with reference to something other than England. Now, Yorkshire is the easiest name to arrive at since each of these counties contain the word Yorkshire within them. Outside of this, it gets more complicated as you would need a name that didn't put one county over and above the others, so these are my names that I came up with if you were interested. I think it makes a lot of sense to call the extreme north Hadriana, as this is where Hadrian's Wall would have run, and as such this area is heavily associated with the Emperor Hadrian. Now, outside of this things get quite difficult, and it's especially hard to come up with a name for the northwest, where Lancaster, Manchester and Liverpool all have their own rivalries, and none of them would stand for a name that wasn't totally neutral. My solution to this would be to look at the Celtic tribes that used to inhabit Britain and use those names, which would make this area Citantia, after the Citanti who used to live there. I actually think it would be totally legitimate to call these 2 states the East Midlands and West Midlands, but if we want to stick with the Celtic theme, then it would be Corytania and Cornovia, respectively. Now yes, it would be very valuable to try and cultivate these regional identities and make them more concrete, but the point is that for every proud Corytanian, for every Citantian flag flown, For every sporting event centred on the fierce rivalry between Yorkshire and Hadriana, the idea of Scotland wanting to leave because of their unique identity becomes ever more illegitimate. Now obviously there are still some logical divisions to make down south, since we're dealing with almost half of the entire British population in southern England, which, by the way, people do complain about the fact that a lot of British stereotypes are in fact southern English stereotypes, but based on pure numbers alone, you can't really be too surprised about that. However, there are still some pretty obvious divisions that should be made, since southern England is not a monolith. Indeed, Cornwall, for example, to which we'll add Devon, already has a profoundly strong national identity anyway, being ethnically and linguistically distinct from the rest of England, and the last part of England that could still be considered indigenously Celtic. However, to distinguish between the state and the county, it would make sense to call this new state Dumnonia, because that was the actual historical name of independent Cornwall. Still, with a very distinct local identity would be the West Country, centred on the city of Bristol, but apart from that, best well known for that one particular type of accent made most famous in Hot Fuzz. This would include, of course, the countries of Somerset, Bristol County, Gloucestershire and Herefordshire, either called Severnia after the River Severn that runs through Bristol, or else Debunia, if we're going by our Celtic tribes rule. Now, the West Country's cousin in the east is East Anglia, which is similar in terms of accent and in being a relatively rural part of southern England. This would consist of the counties of Suffolk and Norfolk and, while not always considered part of East Anglia, Cambridgeshire as well. So obviously we can call this state East Anglia quite comfortably, but we could also call it Icenia, which would be pretty cool since the Iceni were actually the tribe led by Boudica. So again, take your pick. Now the funny thing is that Cambridgeshire arguably doesn't properly belong to East Anglia. It arguably has far more to do with Oxfordshire and, by extension, the counties between Cambridgeshire and Oxfordshire. And therein lies the rub. This entire area here actually doesn't really have many organic divisions. For example, I'm from Buckinghamshire and I can confidently say that I don't feel any closer to somebody from Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, Oxfordshire or Berkshire than I do to somebody from Kent, Sussex or Essex. If we were being totally honest to the actual identities in England, then I don't think that it would be appropriate to divide this part of England up at all, because I don't think this part of England is particularly divided. However, this relatively small part of England is actually home to over 1/3 of the entire British population. It's also again home to the British government, Britain's financial centre, and is the focal point for most of the international perception of Britain as a country. It's easy to see how having one singular state with all of this going for it might cause some serious issues. So I personally cut it up like so. Dorset, Wiltshire, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, East and West Sussex would all come together to form southern England, perhaps called Wessex or otherwise Regnenia. It could even be called Alfred, since many other countries with states have states named after people. Surrey, Kent and Essex would form another state called New Saxony, based on the fact this is where England's Anglo-Saxon colonisers would have first landed. Interestingly, the only Celtic tribal name I could find that corresponded to this location was Cantiesa, which I think is inappropriate since it sounds too much like the derivation for Kent specifically, and the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom based here was also called Kent. On that note, there are some recent controversies about Kent surrounding trade with Europe in a post-Brexit world, so who knows how that would play into this. As for my home county of Buckinghamshire, it would be grouped with the aforementioned Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, Oxfordshire and Berkshire to form Mercia, or perhaps the Celtic name of Catuvilaunia, but probably the first one, because that is a ridiculous name. And finally, this of course leaves London, which could be called Middlesex or Atrobatia, but has no real reason not to keep the name London as the name for the state. And thus you would have Britain, a federal monarchy comprised of 15 states: Scotland, Northern Ireland, Hadriana, Yorkshire, Settantia, East Midlands, West Midlands, Wales, Severnia, Dumnonia, East Anglia, Mercia, Wessex, New Saxony and London, all equally dependent from and equally dependent on one centralised governing authority, most of them, significantly, all with equal claims to their own valid and independent identities. Frankly, I'd say in the interest of simplifying things at this point, I'd argue that the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands and maybe even Gibraltar and the Falklands could get in on this federalisation thing, but that's a whole other issue. The point is that I maintain doing this would stop talks of Scottish independence in their tracks, because suddenly Scotland wouldn't be some forgotten subordinate part of Britain with little relevance. In fact, Scotland would actually become one of the more powerful states in the Union. Now, the point of this video is threefold. Firstly, that when confronted with an existential threat to the existence of the country that I live in, I can't help but take a minute to consider how that threat might be mitigated. The reality is that if Scotland does leave the UK, as I very sincerely believe they might, then the UK really doesn't exist anymore. As I said at the beginning of this video, I don't particularly care for the integrity of national borders, but for the fact that recent changes to the UK's political landscape have forced me to be a bit more interested in those things. So take this as a genuine piece of advice for the British government. Secondly, I think it's significant that this is a solution that really demands nothing of anybody. No extra money needs to be committed to making these changes to the UK. There will be changes to the UK constitution, but only superficial changes. Ultimately, it really doesn't particularly matter how much power the federal government retains or acquiesces, provided that in the end all 15 states are left in equal standing, such that any grievance would be shared grievances and thus less likely to lead to one state trying to break away. I personally find it interesting how many problems there are in politics that actually don't even require costly action to solve them, as long as the action taken is smart. And thirdly, as promised, I think there is something to be gleaned here about the way that identities work and can be used to achieve certain political ends. I talk about identity on this channel quite a lot, and one reason for this is that I don't think identity is an unimportant matter. How individuals and groups come to understand their identities relative to other identities is very important in terms of taking political action, and also curtailing political action. In this case, I am in some sense talking about undercutting a legitimate sense among the Scottish people that they have been wronged. They have their own national identity and every right to proclaim a nation state. They have been dragged into a series of dramatic political actions that they don't want and overwhelmingly didn't vote for. I don't blame them for wanting independence in any way, and yet here I am talking about something which I believe would quite reliably halt any chance of Scotland declaring independence, while not actually redressing any of the meaningful concerns that Scottish people have. And there are other examples of which I can see identities being manipulated in the UK to achieve Machiavellian and quite harmful aims. There are also examples of where I think that manufactured notions of identity can lead to arbitrary divisions that can actually cause political forces to exist that really have no business existing in a society that should be governed by principles of rationality. Look forward to me expanding on that in a video critiquing the Electoral College, which will be released before the 2020 election. Nonetheless, I guess to end on a slightly more positive note, I think that it's also important to bear in mind that identities can be used for positive ends, to facilitate social harmony, and to achieve political ends for marginalised and underrepresented groups. So take this video however you want to take it. As an academic exploration of how political action is often centred around the way that identities are cultivated and harnessed to achieve certain ends, as a simple policy suggestion for how to uphold the international interests and continued existence of the British government, or as a video made by a map nerd in order to justify sharing a map he threw together several years ago that divided the UK into different federal states. The end. Right, so like and comment and subscribe. I'm not going to say share because this video would be a bit strange to share in my humble submission. It's not the kind of video I usually do, and I don't think it's the kind of video where anybody's going to watch and be like, oh wow, this is great, I want to subscribe. However, I do want to thank my Patreons and just let them know that I am aware Patreons don't really pay for me to make these kind of videos. That's not what you're into, but obviously I am still making my gender critical videos and other videos which I think are interesting to people at a consistent rate. So expect my next video to be a video on ContraPoints, so the part 3 of the video. But until then, I will just say thank you to my current patrons: Hannah Taylor, Kirsten, Stephen, Nancy D, Rebel of Empires, Lizu Desu, Constant Disappointment, Adriana Delgado, Harper Cole, Alex Leica, Jane Einstein. Oh wow, that was really funny. I'm going to keep that in. George Sibley, and Katie. Sorry, George, but you're a new patron, so I read your name wrong because I'm not used to saying it. You're all very appreciated.